Well, good morning, everybody. Quite a morning out there. Winter has arrived. Yikes. Yeah, from plus 20 or whatever we had in November to minus 30 this morning, but we all knew it was coming. That's for sure. There's a very good reason that they call it Mother Nature and not Father Nature. Do you get that? Yeah, for sure. That table got it. For sure. Anyway, welcome for sure. We are very, very glad that you are here because we have a lot to say, a lot to discuss, and a lot to, I guess, portray to you as to what we're going to be doing. I'm joined here this morning by outstanding board members, Larry Flowers and Gary Hamblin. Guys, give everyone a wave. Right over here, for sure. And we also have the table that got my lame joke full of WCB experts on my far right. So any questions you have, of course, you can ask them after the session or perhaps even during the session, for sure. But we are here today, and before I just about forgot, Merry Christmas. It's that time of year. Yeah, for sure. It's on the 25th again this year, right? Okay, you got that one, good. We're here today to share the outcomes of the rate model review and explain the board's decisions in regard to an independent actuary's recommendations, which will be applied in January 1st of 2018. The rate model review came about as a result of recommendations from an asset liability study conducted in 2015. The rate model review began earlier this year in 2016. In September, our actuary produced their report, and we are now sharing their recommendations with you and the enhancements to the new model that will be made to the current model. The enhanced rate model is the result of a year of consultation and research by three items. 1, ECLR. 2, our staff. And 3, you, either through personal presentations or presentations through the organizations that you belong to. If you have lived in Saskatchewan for more than the past decade, you will know that our economic and business climate has changed and evolved. Our business pace has increased, but so has our commitment to safety. We have almost 6,000 more active employer accounts than we did 5 years ago, and about 28,000 more workers than we did 5 years ago. But most positively, we have had 7,112 fewer injuries than we did 5 years ago. There are more businesses registered, there are more people working, but there are fewer people getting hurt. Saskatchewan is indeed changing. Our proposed 2017 average premium rate is the lowest rate in over 30 years. And although what I'm about to mention to you has nothing to do with our rate model consultations this morning, as chair of this organization, whenever I come to the mic, I always have to mention, because we are very proud of this fact, and that is that over the past 18 months, we have returned $422 million to employers, which is a direct result of excess surplus investment. So that is good news for sure. So this is all good news for businesses in the province, but it means that we have to change as well. Our goal isn't to have the lowest premium rates in Canada, but rather to remain fully funded in order to protect you, our employers, and meet the needs of the injured workers we serve in the event of the tragedy in a workplace, or worse yet, a fatality. Our new model balances the cost of maintaining workplace compensation while continuing to meet the funding needs of the future. In other words, remaining fully funded while ensuring the present and potential future needs of injured workers. As a board, we are pleased to share this enhanced model with you today. Going forward, early in the new year, we will also host more in-depth sessions that will provide more detail for specific industry rate codes. So as we proceed this morning, I encourage you to get involved in what we have to present this morning. Make notes of the comments and questions that you want to ask, but save your comments and questions for after the presentation. But the whole idea of this consultation is for you to get involved. So please make note of your questions, your comments, and ask them after. And after the session is over, as I mentioned previously, we have a table full of WCB experts that would be glad to engage you in conversation and answer your questions. So thanks again for being here. I really hope you find this session informative, and with that, I'll ask Peter Federico, our CEO, to come and do the presentation. Peter.
Thank you, Gord. Good morning, everyone, and again, let me join with Gord in welcoming everyone here this morning on this blustery winter morning, and a welcome to all of those who are also joining us by webinar this morning. So, as Gord indicated, what we're here to do this morning is to share with you decisions that the board has made with respect to enhancements to our rate-making model that will become effective January 1st, 2018. So we're not using this model for purposes of setting the 2017 rates, which have already been announced, but rather to set the 2018 premium rates. So we have a bit of an agenda this morning, a little bit of background about workers' compensation. How is it that it came to exist? Why does it exist? Why did we embark on the rate model review? What were some of the key findings, or what were the key findings and the board's decisions with respect to changes to the rate-making model? We'll go through the model itself, and then we'll talk about the next steps. So why do you pay workers' compensation premiums? Where did this whole concept of workers' compensation come from? So in Canada, in the early 1900s, particularly in Ontario, they were experiencing, as a result of really industrial revolution that started in Europe in the 1800s, they were experiencing significant growth in the number of injury claims that they were receiving into the system. And back in those days, the only recourse that an injured worker had with respect to being compensated for a workplace injury was to actually sue the employer. And very few of the workers were actually successful. Less than 20% were actually successful in their lawsuits against the employer. And so being destitute and not having an ability to actually generate any sort of earnings or income to support themselves and their families, workers were left with only one alternative, and that was to actually fall upon the social security systems of the day. The government became concerned about that particular aspect because now the responsibility became the responsibility of the government to provide these people with some source of income so that they could sustain their living. Conversely, when the worker was successful in suing, the majority of times the employer ended up going bankrupt, leaving several debts unpaid, which again was a big concern of the government of the day. So in 1911, the Ontario government hired a guy, dispatched a fellow who's come to be known as Sir William Meredith, who was a judge, and asked him to study what was happening around the world with respect to this particular issue and propose some sort of solution. And Meredith came up with this concept that today has become known as the historic compromise. So in consultation with many jurisdictions, workers' comp actually began in Germany in the 1870s, traveling to Germany and elsewhere to discover how other jurisdictions were dealing with this particular issue. He came up with this concept of the historic compromise. And what the historic compromise really meant was that employers guaranteed, promised to pay, agreed to pay all the costs associated with the workers' compensation system. In exchange for that, workers gave up their right to sue. And while that concept of historic compromise, is over 100 years old now, it continues to be one of the foundational pieces of workers' compensation in Canada. And quite frankly, around the world, with the exception of the United States, which has a little bit different model than the rest of us. But fundamentally, the right to sue was given up, in exchange for which employers promised that they would fully fund the cost of the system. Meredith conceived of 5 principles which today continue to be known as the Meredith Principles. First of all, Meredith said this has to be a no-fault system. So this notion of having to prove that somebody was at fault in order to be entitled to some sort of compensation for wage loss and for medical and rehabilitation associated with a workplace injury can no longer be an issue. Otherwise, the compromise itself will fall apart. So he said it had to be a no-fault system. Secondly, he said the benefits to which workers would be entitled needs to be secured, needs to be assured. And so we introduced this concept of security of benefits, which meant that a fund needed to be established, again funded by employer premiums, that would guarantee the payment of all benefits for the life of that claim, and all claims within the system. Thirdly, he said, employers together must share in the risks and the costs of the compensation system through a concept he called collective liability. Collective liability is really, another term for it would be risk pooling, and it's really fundamental to all insurance programs around the world, including workers' compensation. And it simply means that employers together share in the costs. Collectively, they are liable for all of the costs associated with the workers' compensation system, with the one proviso that employers should not be unduly burdened by rare and extremely costly claims. So if we think about our auto insurance or our home insurance, we are put in risk pools together based on the kind of vehicles that we drive or the kinds of things that we have in our homes, wood burning versus gas burning fireplaces. We are put together with other homeowners or car owners, and collectively we share in the costs of all claims that are within our particular risk pool. So that in the event that we do have an insurance claim, we are not reaching into our pocket and paying the full cost of a home replacement. Rather, we've paid these premiums over a period of years in order to ensure that in the event of a particular claim, the insurance company itself will pay for that. So this collective liability concept really is fundamental to all insurance programs. The last 2 principles that Meredith introduced really deal with the way that the compensation system ought to be run. And firstly, Meredith was very concerned about political interference making its way into the compensation system, either for purposes of determining benefits or setting premium rates. And so what he said was that the compensation systems need to be administered by an independent board, a board independent from government. And lastly, that organization needs to be have exclusive jurisdiction to cover workers and employers for workers' compensation, and exclusive jurisdiction to determine all matters within its jurisdiction. So in other words, you can't buy, in Canada anyway, and in many other places around the world except the US, you can't buy workers' compensation insurance anywhere other than the Workers' Compensation Board. Similarly, the board has exclusive jurisdiction to determine all matters within its legislation without any interference from the outside. So what we are doing when we set premium rates is we are trying to balance all of those and be true to all of those principles that continue to be foundation to workers' compensation across the country, and determine the amount of premium required to be collected today in order to pay all future costs on that claim, this concept of security of benefits. So when we set the 2017 premium rate, we actually started our work mid-2016. And what we were doing is we were trying to predict the cost of claims, of injury claims that would occur in 2017, and collect all of the premium necessary in 2017 to fund all costs associated with all claims that will occur in 2017. So we want to be sure that the employers who are reporting to us in 2017 are the ones responsible for paying those injury claims that occur in 2017 and not any future employers. So the concept of today's employers pay for the cost of today's injuries preserved. And secondly, to ensure that security of benefits is preserved so that we're collecting sufficient funds today to pay all the future costs of all injury claims. Now, we don't spend all of that money in the very first year. Injury claims can run as long as 50 years. So if you have a young worker age 16 who gets injured, they can collect compensation if they've got a permanent impairment till the age of 65. And so what we're doing is we're collecting all of that premium today, not spending it in that year. So the difference between what we need to pay in the year and what the future costs will be is invested in an investment portfolio. And right now, there's just under $2 billion sitting in that investment portfolio. That investment portfolio is managed by outside independent investment managers, and they generate a very good return for us. Over the last 8 years, with the exception of 1 year, we actually exceeded our threshold. So what we've determined we need in terms of investment return is 3.25% after inflation. In 2015, we had a return of 5.6%. And many of the previous 2014 was over 9%. In many of the other years, we had more than double-digit returns on our investments. So the difference between the 3.25 that we need and whatever return is generated in the year is what contributes to what Gord referred to as excess investment earnings. And those excess investment earnings, again, as Gord mentioned, are 100% the reason we were able to return $422 million back to employers. It's because the return on our investments has been greater than what's necessary to fund the future claims costs. And secondly, because of the surplus that we hold. Under our funding policy, we have a range, we need to maintain a range of 5 to 20% of our liability to cover years so we don't have to react immediately by increasing premium rates, and we can use that surplus to cover years when we have unexpected economic conditions or investment returns that may in fact be below what we require in order to fund the liability. So in a nutshell, that's what workers' compensation is all about. That's why workers' compensation exists. It's because of this deal that was struck back in the 1900s where employers and workers agreed to this compromise and the formation of an independent compensation system. What do the premiums cover? So under the workers' compensation system, we're responsible for paying all wage loss, all medical, rehabilitation, fatality costs, burial costs, independence allowances, so on and so forth. And so what's on the screen in front of you is actually the 2017 premium rate, which again has been approved by the board at an average rate of $1.24. And you can see that there are various components to the premium rate. There's the compensation cost, which is short-term wage loss. There's health care, earnings replacement, which is really earnings loss for long-term permanent disabilities, vocational rehabilitation, anything that's required for retraining or retrofitting workplaces, independence allowances where an impairment is significant enough that it prevents you from doing some of your day-to-day duties. We will fund that. Or the costs associated with fatalities, and of course the administration of the system itself, what it costs to run the system, plus for any industries that have safety associations, the industries themselves actually fund the safety association. So what you're seeing on the screen here, this 4.7 cents per $100, is really not paid by anyone. That's simply the average of the funding required for all of the safety associations calculated at the board level. So our funds, the funds we collect, the premiums we collect, are intended to cover all of these benefit types that we are obligated under our legislation to cover. So how do we go about setting premium rates? There are really three fundamental things associated with the setting of the premium rates. The first is industry classification, the second is the premium setting process itself, and the third is something we call experience rating. I will cover each of these in a little bit more detail. Again, what we are attempting to do through the rate-making process is predict the future costs of claims for the coming year such that they're sufficient enough to cover all future costs of the claim and converting that into a current premium rate that employers will pay us. So the first thing that we have to do under this collective liability concept is we have to decide how to divide up all of the industries that are in Saskatchewan. And we do that by establishing something called industry rate codes. So based on the underlying business of an employer, we take all employers who are in the same or similar business and we group them into these industry rate codes. So all truckers are put together, all bankers, all hotels, etc., are all put into these separate industry rate codes, and 50 of them in total. All employers within each of those rate codes pay the same base premium rate. So collectively, they are sharing in the costs of all claims that are occurring within their industry classification. Once that is determined, now we have to go into the process by which we determine how much to charge each one of those 50 industry rate codes. Every employer in each of those rate codes, so every trucker, just by way of example, will start off by paying exactly the same base premium rate. So whatever that is, in our example, in terms of the average, if the premium rate for a trucker happened to be $1.24, then every trucker starts out by paying $1.24 per $100 of payroll. However, in order to ensure accountability, which is another fundamental principle in setting of premium rates, is we want to ensure that in order to encourage return to work and injury prevention and to hold employers who are costing the system more with the responsibility of paying more for use of the system, we apply something called experience rating to that base industry rate. So you start off with $1.24, and then we look at your individual performance relative to others that might be in your industry. And our experience rating program is split into two parts. One called the standard program, which is designed for smaller employers. And we define smaller employer as any employer who has paid us less than $21,000 in premium over the previous 3 years. That program is frequency-based. So it's based on the number of claims that you would have, time loss claims in particular. So if you have 0 time loss claims, you could be entitled to a discount of up to 25%. That's the maximum. If you have 1 claim, you will not get any discount or surcharge, but if you have claims in excess of 1, time loss claims in excess of 1, you could receive a penalty of up to 75%. So the $1.24 now turns into $1.24 either minus 25% because you have good injury claim experience, or it could go up by as much as 75% if you have injury experience that is not that good. The second part of the experience rating program is called the advanced program, and it's intended for the larger employer, those who have paid us at least $21,000 in premium over the last 3 years. That program is cost-based. And simply put, if your injury claim experience on a cost basis is worse than the average for your industry, you're going to receive a surcharge. If it's better than the average for your industry, you're going to receive a discount. Under the advanced program, the maximum discount you can receive is 30%. The maximum surcharge you can receive is 200%. So there's a 230% difference between an employer with good injury claim experience compared to one that has not so good injury experience relative to its peers. So the bill that employers will get at the end of the year firstly starts with that base premium rate, in my example of $1.24, and then it's adjusted for the entitlement to either a discount or a surcharge depending on the individual injury experience. So why did we undertake this review of the rate setting model? Well, it was really all part of what I call a review of our financial system. So we have to collect enough premium to pay the cost of claims, we have to pay those claims, and we have the investment earnings that we have to look out for. The investment earnings, except to the extent that the discount rate, the return, is necessary to pay future claims costs, do not actually factor into the determination of premium rates. So the first thing that we did is we looked at the investments that we hold, and we conducted an optimization study, which simply meant we looked at where we were investing our funds and determined whether we could maintain those long-term earnings or exceed those long-term earnings, but reduce the volatility in the returns. So I don't think I have to tell any of you who've got any kind of money sitting in RRSP or pension plans or just invested in the market, how volatile markets can be. What our aim is to maximize the return on the investments that we hold, at the same time taking out the risk or volatility in those returns. So we had this optimization study done to determine whether, having 50% of our portfolio in equities was a wise thing to do, or whether we should diversify into other holdings in order to smooth out and enhance the returns. That was then followed by an asset liability study. An asset liability study simply was, as Gord indicated, started in 2015, was simply to determine whether we had a good match between the assets that we were holding and how they were being invested and what the cash flow requirements were going to be in order to pay out those claims. And part of that asset liability study recommended that we undertake a rate-making model review, because that's a fundamental piece of our overall funding strategy, is to collect sufficient premium in order to pay future claims costs. Lastly, we also determined that we needed to undertake a review of our funding policies. So the asset liability study was completed in 2015. We undertook the rate model review in 2016, which we are now implementing in 2018. Before the end of the year, discussion paper will go out with respect to our funding policy. Decision will be made first quarter of 2017 with respect to, is that 5 to 20% range sufficient, excessive, appropriate in the circumstances? And so for all those reasons, as part of that overall kind of financial system review, the rate model review was undertaken. The second factor that went into this is we heard from employers over the years that they did not believe that the system was reactive enough, that the current model reacted quickly enough to improvements in injury performance. As Gord indicated, we had more than 7,000 fewer claims that we were paying in 2015 than what we had 5 years prior to that. So with the reduction in number of claims, employers were expecting the premium rate setting model to actually adjust the experience more quickly. And so for those reasons, we undertook this study. In undertaking this study, there were three things that were kind of critical as we proceeded. We needed to maintain a high level of fairness and equity and transparency in the model itself. But the first and most significant thing that we were concerned about was the predictability of costs. Was the model that we are currently using doing a good job in terms of predicting the future costs for purposes of determining how much premium we needed to collect? Secondly, the model needed to be fair and equitable to all employers. And lastly, it had to abide by actuarial principles. It had to be true to the Meredith concepts. It had to be true to the principles that actuaries would subscribe to with respect to the development of a premium ranking model. Really what we're trying to do is balance what are often seen as competing principles. So on the one hand, in the blue, we want to balance accountability with the collective liability. So collective liability, again, is what is shared among all employers. And the accountability piece is to what degree do we hold individual rate codes and individual employers accountable for their own experience. And if you increase the collective liability, it actually decreases the accountability. So to the extent that you're sharing costs at a pooled level, takes away the individual responsibility or accountability of those rate codes. If you increase the accountability, it decreases the collective liability. And so what we're seeking to do is to keep those in a reasonable balance. On the other side, we're balancing rate stability with reactivity. As Gord indicated, our objective in setting premium rates, in running our compensation system, is not necessarily to have the lowest premium rate in the country, but to have very, very stable rates. So predictability of cost and stability in premium rates is one of those actuarial principles that was fundamental to the rate model review. If we seek to increase rate stability, try and keep rates level, it reduces the reactivity of the model. It doesn't react as quickly as it perhaps ought to. If we increase the reactivity, make it respond more quickly to either improving or deteriorating injury experience, it actually can create instability in the premium rates and add volatility. So our challenge in looking at the new rate model and the recommendations that were put forward by the actuary was striking this balance to maintain collective liability and yet increase accountability, to make the model react more quickly, but at the same time preserve rate stability. And overall, try and make the model a bit more transparent, which is depicted by kind of the open book here. So the model ought to be relatively easy to explain, and you're going to wonder whether that in fact happened this morning or not, and relatively easy to understand, so that the mystery of the setting of the premium rates is no longer a mystery, but a little clear. So what did Eckler discover? Firstly, he determined that the process for establishing premium rates is sound, and at the overall level collects the required premium. And by overall level, I mean if we take all 50 industry codes together, our model is doing a good job of determining collectively at that 50 rate code level the amount of premium that's required. It was not doing as good a job, however, at the individual industry rate codes. What Eckler determined is the rate model is not broken. It does not need an overhaul. It just needed a little bit of refinement, a little bit of tweaking to improve our ability to set premium rates at the individual industry code level, not necessarily at the overall board or pool level. And his recommendations cover 7 different areas ranging from credibility all the way to the allocation of our administration costs, and I'll get into each of those in a little bit more detail. So as I mentioned, we have 50 industry rate codes in Saskatchewan. Each of those rate codes, premium rate, is based on the experience of all employers within that particular rate code. Saskatchewan's not a very big place. And while the number of covered firms has increased, some of these industry rate codes are extremely small. If you have a small group of employers put together in an industry rate code, it doesn't take a lot in terms of injury claim experience to create volatility. So, small employers in particular might have an injury claim, but 1 in every 10 or 11 years. And in that particular year, when that injury claim occurs, particularly if it's a costly claim, it can really cause huge swings in the premium rates. The extent to which the experience of an individual rate code is reliable in predicting future costs is something that we call credibility. So if I don't have very much injury experience, and we're using that injury experience to try and predict what the injury experience is going to be in the future, it's more of an art than a science. It's kind of like throwing darts. Because there simply isn't enough experience, reliable experience in that history to allow us to accurately predict what the future experience might be. Under the current model, we determine levels of credibility based on premiums that are paid. And it's premium divided by premiums plus $2.5 million or something like that. So if a rate code is determined to have a low credibility, what we're currently doing is we're blending the experience of the industry rate code with the experience of all of the industry rate codes, what we call at the board level, in order to take the volatility out of the injury claim experience and increase the predictability of future costs. Eckler said, you need to let the industries really stand more on their own injury experience without creating that volatility. So stop blending everybody 100% at the board level and let the model determine to what extent employers should be held accountable for their own injury claim experience compared to the injury experience of all 50 industry rate codes taken together. So Eckler helped us redefine what credibility meant. Instead of it being premium-based, it's now going to be cost-based. So if over the previous 5 years, you've had roughly $16.5 million in claims costs flow through that rate code, you would be considered a credible rate code. To the extent that you have less than that, we'll reduce the credibility. We'll reduce the reliability of historical costs in predicting what future costs are going to be. So what Eckler said is when you have rate codes that have low credibility, you should blend their 5-year injury claim experience with their 10-year injury claim experience so you have a wider window. So under the current model, what we do is we look at the last 5 years of injury experience to help us predict what the future is. And then we have to intervene in those small rate codes and do that blending that I talked about in order to increase the predictability. Eckler said, don't intervene anymore. If you have a rate code with low credibility, use their most current 5 years to the extent that they are credible and blend that with their 10-year experience in order to increase the predictability. So what that means is if an industry code has roughly $10 million running through it over the last 5 years, they would have a credibility rating of about 60%. So in determining the future claims costs, what we would do is we would take 60% of the average of the last 5 years, and we'd blend that with 40% of their injury experience for 10 years. And that increases the reliability, the predictability of future costs. So this whole issue of how do you deal with these smaller rate codes that can have volatile experience is to take a larger chunk of data for the percentage that they are not credible. If they're only 50% credible, then we would take 50% of the average of the last 5 years, and we'd blend that with 50% of the average of the last 10 years. So that's one of the first recommendations Eckler gave us, and one of the enhancements that the board has agreed to. So for purposes of setting premium rates, we're going to change the definition of who's big enough to stand on their own and to what extent can they stand on their own experience. With respect to the classification system itself, Eckler said that we ought to develop a process by which we periodically review all classification systems, with the thought in mind of perhaps merging some of these smaller rate codes with other rate codes with similar experience. We do that from time to time, but mostly on an ad hoc basis, and we really don't have a process whereby we periodically would review these classifications. Eckler has suggested that we develop that process. We agreed that we will, but there's no changes coming for 2018 until we actually develop this process by which we would review the 50 rate codes that we currently have to determine whether there's something we can do to increase the credibility of those individual rate codes, possibly by bringing them together. We didn't undertake this in 2016 for 2018 because it's quite an arduous process. We're not going to, without consultation, we're not going to suddenly start grouping industry rate codes together. We will want, because there'll be winners and losers on both sides. Someone's rate will go up and someone's rate will go down as a result of the amalgamation. So we will want to do some research on our own in order to find perhaps industries that have similar experience that might be eligible for merging, and we would want to enter into consultation with those employers and those rate codes prior to actually amalgamation so that they understand. So no change at this time, but we will develop a process whereby we will continue on a periodic basis to review the classifications. Next, Eckler talked about the use of indicators to predict costs. So in the current model, what we do is we actually forecast the number of injury claims. So we're sitting here in 2016 and we're trying to determine the number of claims we're going to have in 2017, adjusting it for a whole bunch of things. Eckler said that's not a very reliable way of projecting your injury experience because there's extreme volatility, there can be extreme volatility in the number of claims. And secondly, while again, as Gord indicated, we've seen a significant reduction in the number of claims, we've actually seen an increase in claims costs. So there's no longer a correlation, while there used to be. Before we had the incredible growth in our economy, before we saw these significant decreases in the number of claims, there actually was a close correlation between the number of time loss injuries and what our injury claims costs were. That correlation no longer exists. So what Eckler suggested is that we use historical costs, forget about the number of claims, and just rely on your claims costs, the average of your claim costs, to determine what future claim costs are going to be regardless of the actual number of claims. But use the change in the workforce to index or adjust that average. So if we're talking about a fully credible employer, someone who can 100%, or rate code I should say, a rate code who can 100% stand on its own injury experience, excuse me, we would be looking at the last 5 years, the average of the last 5 years of injury claims costs. Then what we would do is we would look at the forecasted change in the workforce, which simply means the estimated change in the number of insured workers for that particular rate year. So if we're seeing through wage growth, through employment growth, we're seeing, let's say, a 2% increase in the number of folks working, we would index or adjust that 5-year average by that 2% growth in the workforce. So no longer looking at the number of time loss claims, now relying strictly on the injury claims costs, adjusting it for the change in the workforce. So just to reinforce that point, the red line up here represents the change in the workforce since 2000. The blue line represents the injury claims costs. You can see they follow each other very closely, a very, very tight correlation. If we had the number of time loss claims on here, you would actually see that line go down and it would be sitting down here someplace. You see the disparity between the number of time loss claims and actually the injury claims costs. There's no longer that tight correlation. As a matter of fact, the actuaries determined there's a negative 88% correlation between number of time loss claims and injury claims costs, while there's a 97% positive correlation between change in the workforce and the injury claims costs. So we've adopted that recommendation of Eckler. We will no longer be using the number of time loss claims to predict what the future claims are going to be. We will use historical costs adjusted for the change in the workforce. Next, we looked at the degree to which we should maintain collective liability. So the credibility piece really is an attempt, remember that scale where we had accountability and collective liability. By changing the credibility factors and applying that 5 and 10-year blending to strengthen the predictability of costs in the smaller rate codes, we are actually increasing the accountability of the individual rate codes by making them stand or rely more on their own injury experience as opposed to the blended experience. But we have to maintain that other balance, that other side of the scale being the collective liability. So we look at the degree to which we should actually pool claims costs. And what Eckler said, yes, collective liability means that employers together share in the costs of the injury claims, but he also said that employers should not be unduly burdened for extremely and rare costly claims. What we currently do in the model is we only pool claims with respect to the earnings replacement or pension costs. So we only look at those long-term claims. And we pool costs at the industry class level when the costs of the claim exceed $90,000. And it's been $90,000 for a long, long time. The first thing Eckler said is you shouldn't pool at the industry class level, but pool at the overall board level among all 50 industry rate codes. Secondly, he said don't use a fixed amount, this $90,000, but rather index it. Make it change over the years to reflect changes in workforce, changes in insurable wages. Make it more responsive. Then he said, use total claims costs, not just the pension costs. So apply your claim cost pooling to all injury claims costs, not just those long-term pension costs. And instead of distributing the pooled costs on the basis of payroll, use the actual pro rata share of injury claim costs to redistribute the pooled amount into the industry codes. So this increases, as I said, this increases the collective liability on those very expensive kind of rare claims. And our decision was to apply a claims cost capping, if I can put it that way, at 3 times the maximum ultimate insurable earnings. So 2014 legislation changed, increased the maximum wage base, insurable earnings. And one of the elements was for claims that occurred after January 1st, 2014, is to ensure that the maximum by the year 2019 equals 165%. So since 2014, we've been gradually increasing that insurable earnings piece so that by the time we hit January 1, 2019, it will equal 165% of average industrial wage. By tying the claims cost capping limit to the growth in the insurable earnings, we're in effect introducing an indexing provision for that claims cost capping. We're estimating that 3 times, based on our projected maximum insurable earnings, that 3 times maximum insurable is roughly $250,000. So what this means is if a claim costs exceed $250,000, the difference between the total cost of the claim and that $250,000 will be spread across all 50 industry codes. So the industry code will be charged $250,000. If the claim costs $350,000, we would take that $100,000, we'd put it up at the board level, and on the basis of claims costs in all those 50 rate codes, each rate code would take on a share of that excess amount. Similarly, balancing the accountability with the collective liability, the actuary looked at the allocation of fatality costs. Under the current model, every one of the industry rate codes gets charged the same amount with respect to the funding of fatalities, regardless of whether they actually had any fatalities. So we calculate a 10-year average, and based on that 10-year average fatality cost, every one of those 50 individual rate codes pays their proportionate share of that average fatality cost. What Eckler said is that is not accountable enough. Without increasing accountability, it's very hard to incent someone to take on some prevention initiatives. So he said you have to hold the industry rate codes that are actually having the fatalities more accountable for the cost of those fatalities. And so what the board has agreed to and decided is that these costly fatality claims will be treated like any other serious injury, subject to that claim cost cap that I just told you about. So if a particular industry has had 3 fatalities, and on an individual claim-by-claim basis, those fatalities cost more than $250,000, we would take the difference between the actual fatality costs and the $250,000, we would pool that together with the claim cost capping coming from any other serious injury, and again, distribute that among the 50 rate codes on the basis of their injury claims experience. Fatalities can have a huge range of costs. A single person with no dependents might only be entitled to $20,000 in burial costs, whereas an individual with dependents, young dependents, that claim could be $1.6 million. By treating those fatalities like any other serious injury, using the upper end of that range, if it's a $20,000 fatality claim, the industry will get charged 100% with that $20,000. If it's a $1.6 million fatality claim, the industry will get charged $250,000, and the difference, the $1.3 million roughly, will get spread among all other industry rate codes on the basis of their costs. Increases the accountability, but still maintains collective liability with respect to the expensive claims. Next, we address the long-term claims. So under the current model, as I said, we look at the last 5 years of injury claim experience, and we determine that average and use that to predict the future. However, in those 5 years of claims costs, there could be claims costs associated with a claim up to 50 years old. So if we have a claim that's either a long-term earnings replacement or pension claim that is continuing to receive benefits today, or we have ongoing medical that's required with respect to a claim that happened, let's say, 10 years ago, when we look at our 5-year averaging under the current model, we're going to include costs associated with that claim regardless of the year of injury. Eckler said that that was not a reasonable way to approach this, and rather suggested that we should shorten the period of time that we're looking at in terms of calculating the 5-year average. Now, again, this would apply equally if we're talking about an employer with low credibility, where we're looking at the 10-year average. But what Eckler said is instead of including claims costs from claims that are up to 50 years old, do not go back any more than 7 years from the year of injury. And only use that 7 years of recent experience in determining your either 5 or 10-year average. What this does is it kind of reinforces the principles of today's employers ought to pay for the cost of today's injuries. It deals with something that we call intergenerational inequity, where costs of previous employer might continue to be paid by current employers today when that employer might not even be around anymore, or the circumstances and legal framework has actually changed. By limiting it to 7, we are increasing the predictability of costs. We are reducing this cross-subsidization that might occur by us dragging forward costs associated with very, very old claims. The difference between the 7-year experience and the remaining 43 years, because we still run these claims out 50 years, but we're only using, for purposes of calculating the 5 or 10-year average, we're only using the most recent 7 years of injury claims experience. We're not ignoring the other 43 years of costs. Rather, we're taking those 43 years of average claims costs and we're pooling that again at the board level and redistributing that difference among all 50 rate codes, again on the basis of their individual claims experience. To depict this graphically, so this tan line here represents the industry costs that we will use for purposes of calculating the average. So when we were setting 2017 premium rates, we used the most recently fully completed 5 years of injury claim experience in determining that average. So we would go back as far as 2015, because it's the most recent fully completed year. We'd go from 2015 to 2011. And we would take all the costs, this whole graphic, going back 50 years, all the way back to 1961. And any claims costs paid in 2015, even associated with a 61 claim, would go into the determination of our 5-year average. Adopting Eckler's recommendation, we will only look at the most recent 7 years, this tan section. So for 2015, we'll only go as far back as 2009. For 2014, we're only going to go back as far as 2008, 2007, 6, 5, etc. If we were doing 10 years for low credibility, this would just keep sliding down year by year so that we're only grabbing 10 years of injury claim experience for purposes of determining those averages. The difference, this blue line here, which runs back all the way to 50 years, so 1966 in terms of 2015 injury claims, this blue section here from 2009 to 1967 would be pooled and distributed among all of the 50 industry rate codes. So we would take all of this blue area here for these past 5 years, We would pool that at the board level, and on the basis of injury experience, claim experience, we would distribute that among the 50 industry rate codes. Increases the predictability and reliability and takes out this intergenerational cross-subsidization that may in fact occur in the existing model. Next, Eckler looked at the way that we're actually allocating our administration costs. Under the current model, we divide our administration costs between fixed and variable costs. Fixed costs are what you would consider to be fixed costs, costs that are not necessarily related to our claims activities. So it's salaries for guys like me who do not actually physically touch any claims. It's the lights and the power, the IT support, the HR support, all of those kind of administrative costs that are not related to actually the degree to which you do business with us. We call those fixed costs. Everything else, which is primarily all costs associated with managing claims, are considered variable costs. Under the existing model, we assumed that 10% of our administration costs were fixed. And those costs, that 10% of admin cost, is spread across all industry codes on the basis of payroll. 90%, the variable cost component, are spread across all 50 industry rate codes on the basis of claims costs. Eckler, when he looked at this, said, you need to check this because 90-10 seems to be out of whack with what I'm seeing in other jurisdictions. So he's done work with many other workers' compensation boards. And so when we dived into this and actually looked at the distribution of our administration costs, we determined that 70% of our administration costs are actually variable and 30% are fixed. Eckler said you need to fix that because someone with very low claims costs but extremely high payroll who still might draw on your employer services and the rest of the infrastructure needs to pay their fair share of those administration costs. So the board has agreed and adjusted the split between fixed and variable from 10 and 90% to 30 and 70%. The 30% distributed on the basis of payroll, the 70% distributed on the basis of claims costs. So the more business you do with us from a claims management perspective, the greater portion of the variable costs you're going to have to be responsible for. So the rate model process then is simply to take the industry claims experience, one of these 50 rate codes, we look at their individual injury claim experience, applying the credibility factor, so 5 years if you're a credible industry, 10 years if you're not, or blend of the two if you're somewhere in between. We apply the claims cost capping. We limit your claims costs to 3 times maximum ultimate insurable earnings. We distribute the allocation of administration costs on the basis. We look at your averages and determine what your actual industry claim experience is. And that's the first element that goes into establishing what we call industry fully funded cost of claims. Then we take your share of the pool costs and we distribute that to you on the basis of your claims experience, basis of your claims costs. So included in that pool are any costs in excess of that $250,000 maximum, both for serious injuries as well as fatalities, as well as that 43 years of claims experience, old claims experience, that we are no longer putting into the determination of the industry claim experience. We're just limiting it to 7 years, not 50 years. So we've got everything that resulted from the capping of claims costs, as well as any additional costs beyond the 7 years of most recent claim experience, most recent 7 years. And that is all pooled in one big pool and on the basis of claims costs distributed among the 50 rate codes. So we take the individual claims experience plus your share of this collective liability of the overall costs, and that then becomes the costs that you as an industry are responsible for. Then we add in the administration costs based on the 30-70 split. If you're an industry that has a safety association, we add in whatever's required in order to fund that safety association, and that tells us what the required premium is. We then take that requirement for premium, we divide it by the industry payroll, times it by 100, and that gives us the industry base premium rate. This would be the $1.24, that average rate of $1.24 that I showed you earlier. And as I said early on in the presentation, we would then take this industry-based premium rate and we'd apply the experience rating at the individual employer level to determine how much you actually owe us in the way of premium. So, for those of you that attended our rate setting meeting, you would have seen this graph. And what this shows is what the outcome of the 2017 rate-making process was. So this reflects that $1.24, and on an individual rate code basis, what it actually meant to the individual rate codes. So the green, the big green section here, represents the number of employers and rate codes that saw their premium rate actually go down. It's just shy of 95%. The little red slice in here depicts the number of employers and rate codes that were going to increase, but less than 10.5%. It's like 0.4%. 212 employers. We're going to see their rate go up, are going to see their rate go up in 2017, but by less than 10.5%. And the remaining slice here is simply employers who were not seeing their rate either go up or down, no change in their premium rate. 2,367 employers, just under 5% of those were seeing no change in their rate. So close to 95% here, 0.5% of employers over here seeing their rate go up, about 5% seeing their rate stay the same. Excuse me. If we would have implemented the new rate model for purposes of setting the 2017 premium rate, it would have looked like this. The green piece is still the employers and rate codes that would see their rate go down. So instead of 45,778 employers seeing their rate decrease, you actually see only 27,755 employers see their rates go down. This salmon-colored piece here are actually increases of employers where the rate would go up by less than 10.5% had we implemented the model. Remember in the previous slide, there were only 200 and some employers that were seeing their rates go up by less than 10.5%. Had we implemented the new model, 10,000 employers would have seen their rates increase by less than 10.5%. This slice right here represents employers who would actually see their rates go up by more than 10.5%. Under the current model, there aren't any employers that would have seen their rate increase by more than 10.5%. If we had implemented the new model, almost 4,800 employers would see their rates go up by more than 10.5%. Still a slice of employers that would see their rate change. 5,600 employers would see no change in their premium rate compared to 2,300 employers who would see no change in their premium rate. Under the current model in setting the 2000 premium rates, the maximum decrease was about 18.5%. And the maximum increase is 2.6% on average. Had we implemented, I'll repeat it, Ken, I see you missed that. Under this model here, the existing model, the maximum increase on average for this group of employers that were seeing their rates go up by less than 10.5% was 2.6%. So that's the largest increase in 2017 using the existing model. Had we implemented the new model, the average increase for employers that would go up by either less than 10.5%, more than 10.5%, the largest increase was 27.9%. Under the existing model, the largest decrease under the existing model for this whole group of employers here, the largest decrease was 18.6%. Had we implemented the new model, the largest decrease actually been 34.8%. So as a result of the changes in the way we allocate the fatality costs by holding employers more accountable, by changing the allocation between fixed and variable administration costs, by changing the credibility factors, by introducing the claim cost capping tied to the maximum insurable, it significantly changes how the premium rates would have been set at the individual rate code level. These two pies, this one under the existing model and this one under the new model, are exactly the same size. In total, this would not generate any more premium revenue for the Workers' Compensation Board than this model. So the $1.24 still would have been a $1.24 average. The difference is to what degree we are holding rate codes more accountable for their own injury experience, and in a fairer, more equitable way distributing the pooled costs. Because of the significance of the change between, that's pretty shocking, isn't it? You look at this picture, and then you look at this picture on the basis of changes that will be implemented in 18. Pretty shocking and significant difference. If we'd have just gone ahead and implemented this change without actually trying to help you understand why and how it's going to change in 2018, I don't think you'd have been very happy with us. Hence the decision to wait until 2018 to actually implement this model. As Gordon mentioned, our next steps, so we've got this meeting this morning where we're trying to inform you, hopefully in as transparent a way as to make it understandable to you, to advise you of what the new model looks like and what the overall impacts at just a very, very high level are. Beginning in January through to the end of March, we'll be holding industry-specific meetings. And what we'll be showing you in those meetings is how this pie changes for your individual industry code, what the impact to you, to your individual rate code is as a result of implementation of the new model. So the decisions with respect to changes in the model have been made, and they will become real in 2018. There's one decision that hasn't been made that part of our industry meetings will be used to consult on. And that is, how do we manage the transition from this to this? From having the maximum increase of 2.6% jumped to a maximum increase of 27.9%, while maintaining the overall revenue requirements that we need in order to pay the future claims costs. So the options are, how do we transition that? We'll let the new model run because it will react to the injury claim experience. But we've got this 1 year of transition from 17 to 18 that needs to be dealt with. And the board's interested in hearing feedback around how we might transition this. The impact of the implementation, not the implementation itself. We could just go full out in 2018 and you'd see significant results. Some very big decreases, some very big increases. We could perhaps spread that transition, the cost of implementing over a 2-year period or 3-year period. It's those kinds of things that we will be looking for in terms of input and feedback when we get into the industry-specific meetings. And of course, I would be remiss in closing if I didn't remind us all that the least expensive injury is the injury that never occurs. And just one injury, one fatality is one too many. Thank you for your support with respect to Mission Zero. I can't believe Gord failed to mention this in his comments because he almost always does. But last year we had 87% of workplaces in Saskatchewan go injury-free, 0 injuries. Mission Zero is possible. Mission Zero is happening in the majority of workplaces in Saskatchewan. And so we thank you for your ongoing commitment, ask for your ongoing commitment to Mission Zero and to making Saskatchewan a better place to work, live, and play. Thank you all very much for your attentiveness this morning, for being with us here today and learning about changes that are coming to your compensation system. And with that, I'm happy to open it up for any questions or comments that you might have. If you could please use the microphone, just we are recording the questions. And for the benefit of those that are joining us by webcast. Anything online come through, Carolyn?
Not yet.
You knew it had to come.
Morning, Ken.
I have to commend you guys. You do a very tough job. WCB is, I think you're one of those institutions that the employers love to hate, but I think that you deserve much more respect than you get. I have some questions, and I should introduce myself. I'm Ken Ricketts with the Safety Association of Saskatchewan Manufacturers, and just give you a little background. Of those rate codes that are, and I realize that the rate code amalgamations or changes are somewhere down the road. Off the top of my head, I believe that our safety association has 3 of the smallest rate codes in the province, and that manufacturing has 4 of the smallest 10. So we'll be waiting with bated breath somewhat there. But we are also the fastest improving. And some of the adjustments in here, I think the volatility, the stability, obviously when we're the fastest improving, we'd prefer perhaps a little more volatility. But, question, the standard program, about 70% of our clients are in the standard program. You commented that it was frequency-based. Is that on time lost claims or total claims going forward?
Time loss only.
Time loss only, thank you. And then the other question, and this is just because I'm a numbers geek, do the claims from the past 10, 15, 20, 50 years that are added into our current experience calculations, because when you said what we started with, claims from 50 years ago should be paid for by the firms of 50 years ago, but all of a sudden that a claim is being added into our experience rating, it appears that we are paying some of it. And then sitting here, I thought, but does the 3.52%, 3.52, 3.54 after inflation that you're looking for on your investments?
3.25.
3.25, sorry. Is that somewhat close to the cost of the ultra long-term claims? Or are we in fact paying a little bit for those past employers?
Okay, so there's a few things in that second one there, Ken. So by shortening up the tail, if you will, by limiting what goes into the 5 or 10 year average to just the most recent 7 years, we are actually enhancing the reactivity of the model. The other 43, and the reality is when we look at how costs are spent, 75% of claims costs are spent within the first 7 years. So there's 25% of the claims cost yet to come over the remaining 50 years, or 43 years, I should say. For purpose of experience rating, we're looking at the costs over the last 3 years, which, Justin, I can't remember. Would those last 3 years include claims from 50 years ago? They would. Because we have yet to integrate, and it's another thing on our to-do list here, is look at ways that we can better align what's happening within experience rating with the rate setting process. So yes, it's possible that a claim from 50 years ago could have costs associated with it and affect your experience rating, but would not be it'd be rare to have it be very, very large, simply because we're spending a whole bunch. Now, we do have retroactive decisions that are made, like on appeals, where we might be paying back on a claim that, from the 1990s or 1980s. There could be a recurrence that occurs, and those costs would get, lumped into that particular injury year. But that's not very often that would happen, so I don't think it'd have a significant impact for the most part on the experience rating piece. But on our to-do list for the future is to look at how we better align what's happening in experience rating with what's happening in rate setting. Now, that would only affect employers in the advanced program, which is only, around 20% of our employers are actually in the advanced program. The vast majority, 80% plus, are actually part of the standard program. It is time loss claims only that go into that frequency determination. A change that was made to the experience rating program effective January 2017 is we heard from employers about the relative inequity of having a medical-only claim counted as a time loss claim and affecting the experience rating. What I'm talking about there is if a worker has an injury, but they come back to work immediately, they're being fully accommodated, but they have ongoing medical, so they have to take an hour off here or there to attend some sort of medical appointment. As soon as we got the medical report from the doctor saying, Joe was here for a 1 hour appointment, gave him this treatment or whatever, that claim would flip from a no time loss claim into a time loss claim. And would affect that small employer's experience rating. It just disqualify them from a discount, or could actually result in a bit of a surcharge. The new experience rating program changes made is we do not count medical-only time loss payments for purposes of determining the experience rating. So we're just totally ignoring those. Your last question about the 3.25 really doesn't have anything to do directly with long-term claims costs. It does and it doesn't. So because we're collecting all this premium up front and we're going to pay these costs over a number of years, it's kind of like your RRSP or planning your retirement or something. So you want to retire in 10 years, and you would like to have X number of dollars to spend every year 10 years from now. So the question becomes, how much do I have to invest today at a certain assumed rate of return in order to allow me to have that pension or RRSP or whatever on the day that I retire? So what we're doing is we're collecting this premium on the basis of We know we're going to spend 75% of claims costs in the first 7 years, and then the other 25% over the remaining 43 years. How much is that? In real dollars, how much is that? But we don't need to collect the absolute amount of that. We need to collect what we call the net present value. How much do I have to invest today in premiums at an assumed rate of return in order to pay 50 years of claims costs? That's what we're trying to figure out. And so the 3.25% is the return after inflation, which is running around 2%. So we want a real rate of return of 3.25% earned on those premiums that we invest in order to secure benefits over that 50-year period. That's what the 3.25 is about. Now, I'm not sure whether I should even go here. If you were thinking of going there, it might just confuse matters. To the extent that that discount rate changes, though, does change the amount of premium we have to collect today. If we assume we're going to earn a lower rate of return, it means we have to collect more money today. If we assume we're going to earn a higher rate of return, it means we have to collect less money today because it's going to generate more return over the long term that will allow us to pay those future claims costs. So it is kind of tied to the claims costs, but it's more related to the return we have to earn on the premium in order to pay those costs. I hope that answered your question, Ken. Sort of?
Hi, Peter.
Hi, Sandra.
Sandra Cripps with the Saskatchewan Association for Safe Workplaces and Health. I guess just on the heels of that conversation around the excess investment earnings, and I think both Gord, you mentioned around the $420 million. And when I made a quick review of the policy at WCB around how that funds get distributed back to employers, I'm just wondering, given this transitional time that you're in, has there been any consideration to influence, if you feel that's possible, to influence employers to reinvest even a portion of those returns back to them when you're in that situation, to put it towards prevention, and or to allocate a portion for one-time prevention initiatives that could help accelerate some of the improvements that we're seeing in various industries? And the only reason I mention that is I'm not exactly sure what levers to address in terms of trying to enhance those kinds of prevention initiatives. So I just kind of put that out there. And then the only other thing is lots of information shared today, and thanks very much for all your hard work. Is there any consideration in advance of the industry-specific sessions to make available like a side-by-side, like where you can kind of see, because I'm not exactly sure, it's so much information to clearly see what's changed, like in this is the way it was and this is where we're going and the why. You've done a good job explaining it, but just a one page, like a bit of a visual if possible, but just a thought.
So we will have that available for sure for the industry-specific meetings, kind of like the before and after here. We'll only be showing you that with respect to the 2017 rates because we could predict total costs for 2018. We couldn't do it at the individual rate code level. So we're not going to even, because it's also impacted by whatever the injury claim experience is. We had positive injury claim experience in 2016, pardon me. If that doesn't continue, then it's going to adversely affect the premium rates in addition to whatever impact the implementation of the model has. So we won't have the 18 for you, but for sure we'll have the side by side. Now ideally, and I don't know how doable this is or where we are in the process, guys, if we get that out to you in advance of the meeting so you have some time to look at it, I guess would probably make the meeting far more productive and fruitful. So we'll do our level best to try and get that out to you in advance. We need to know who's coming. We're not going to put individual industry experience up on the internet for all to see. We will only share that with the members of that industry code.
We just had one question about when the presentation was going to be available. So we've got a video presentation. This video presentation will be available on the website as well as the slide presentation. So you'll be able to watch it again.
So we did this similar thing in Saskatoon and Prince Albert last week. And so the presentation from Saskatoon is on our website. This one will be very shortly on our website as well. And the presentation materials itself is already up on our website. So WCBSAS.com. Other questions, comments? Thank you again for coming. Stay warm and safe out there. And hope to see you at the industry-specific meetings, and bring your colleagues from the industry. We just think it's extremely important that employers understand the elements of this new model and the high-level impacts it's likely to have on them. So we'd appreciate seeing you in the new year. Do have a wonderful Christmas holiday season, and all the best to you in 2017. Again, thanks very much for being with us here this morning.